Good evening, Mount Zion family and friends. Thank you once again for joining us for our Wednesday evening Bible study. I think we've got the tech issues figured out, but that's probably because we've got Brandon Kyles in-house with us this evening. So we're thankful for that. We've got everything working. Hopefully the sound is good quality for you. Please comment in the boxes below. Let us know that you're watching and let us know that video and sound quality is good. Don't judge by the speaker, the voice, or the way I look, but instead just judge by the way that you're hearing and seeing right now. Anyways, we're glad that you're here. We're thankful for you, and we're excited for another study tonight going through a new minor prophet. We get to introduce a new minor prophet this evening. So we've been going through the minor prophets on our Wednesday evening series, and we've made it to the book of Micah. Book of Micah. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Micah. It is the book right after Jonah, which we just finished. And we're going to introduce who Micah is this evening, where he's from, who he's prophesying to, the major theme of his book. And then hopefully, Lord willing, if we have time, we will go through chapters 1 and 2. So Micah, if you're open up there now, we'll go ahead and introduce him. Micah was from a town southwest of Jerusalem, southwest, and it's called Moresheth, and you see that in verse 1. And Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, which just means that he prophesied during the same time period as Isaiah. And you can see that this time period was during the time of three specific kings that Micah mentions in verse 1. He says first the king of Jotham, who was a king of Judah, and he reigned somewhere around 750 to 735 BC. And then you have King Ahaz, another king of Judah. He reigns between 735 and 715 BC. And then you have King Hezekiah. You're probably very familiar with Hezekiah. He's pretty popular. And he reigned from 735 to 715, or rather 715 to 687 BC. Now, Micah also prophesies during the time of another prophet that we've studied, and his name is Hosea. But what you'll remember is that Hosea prophesies to the northern kingdom, which is Israel, that's right. And Micah primarily prophesies to the southern nation, the southern kingdom, which is Judah. That's right, very good. But Micah does mention a few judgments, or he at least mentions the judgment, the exile that will come to the city of Samaria, which is the capital city of Israel. And so he mentions this a few times in his book, and so he does kind of have a message for both the northern and southern kingdoms, and sometimes we see that through these prophecies. Now, Micah probably was prophesying during the time, if he's prophesying during the time of these kings, he most likely or possibly, probably was prophesying during the time of the Assyrian captivity of Israel, or when Israel is taken captive by Assyria, which is 722 BC. Now, that's about the time period and who Micah is. We don't know much else other than those things. And it's important for us to understand that so that we get a good picture of the type of people that Micah's talking to when he speaks to primarily the southern nation of Judah. Now, what's so fascinating about this book is Micah has one central theme. And I spoke about this in that preview earlier for those of you who were able to watch that. If you didn't watch it, that's okay. You don't have to. It's going to mention the same thing that we mentioned tonight. But one of the things I mentioned was a central theme that really centered around the entire book of Micah. And this theme is actually a back and forth between two very common biblical words that we need to know about. And so the first word is judgment. And it's this idea that God must confront and judge evil among his people, among those who are disobedient and wayward and wicked. But the second word is hope. And this is the idea that God's covenant love and his covenant promise are more powerful than any human evil. And so Micah presents throughout the entire book this back and forth, this sort of ping pong between judgment and hope, and judgment and hope. And it's played out over and over and over again. And with every pronouncement of judgment, there is an extension of hope. And what's so great about this book is that hope actually outweighs the judgment. You see the hope more often, more frequently, and more extensive than you see the judgment. And so I want to kind of present to you on screen here the layout of the book. And so we'll just go kind of section by section, and you'll see this back and forth. So first you see the judgment of nations in chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 11. Here there's a prediction in these verses here. There is the prediction of judgment because of the grievous sins of both Samaria, the capital of Israel, and Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. The destruction is coming by way of the exile, and God will confront and judge the evil among his people in both the north and the south. But then in chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, hope comes in the form of God's restoration. And so you see the hope from a shepherd, this hope for a remnant of Israel, and it's portrayed as God being the shepherd who rescues his flock. Now, this hope is short-stated as prediction of judgment comes again in chapter 3, this time the judgment of leaders. This time the judgment is even more specific toward the leader of the people, and the destruction and exile is coming because of their wicked injustice like what we saw in the book of Amos, and the betrayal of the love that God teaches. But once again, even after judgment, hope comes in chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. But this time the hope is seen in God's love and his desire to restore his spiritual Jerusalem and invite all to come to his holy temple. Now the hope continues as a theme. Isn't that exciting in chapter 4, verse 8 through chapter 5? And it's the hope by restoration. It's a progressive hope now in which God shows his love by delivering the evil nation of Assyria into the hands of the evil nation of the Babylonians. And then from there, the people of Israel will be restored, and eventually they'll be allowed to return to Jerusalem. And we know this biblical story. This hope is even more continual, though, because Micah predicts the new Messiah who will reign as king forever. And this Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Does that sound familiar? He will rule over God's people, and finally the remnant of God's people will not become the remnant will become the blessing to all nations promised to Abraham long ago. Now, in the final chapters, chapter 6 through chapter 7, verse 7, we see the judgment in this courtroom scenario. And it's where we're brought into God's courtroom, where he indicts the people of all of their sins and their wicked ways. And God presents his case before them, and there's really only one verdict, and that verdict is guilty. But the book does not end here. There is actually a final invitation to hope, a hope in God in chapter 7, verses 8 through 20. This time the hope is directly in who God is. It's his character that is hope. And God also promises, his promises bring hope. You see, in each of the previous minor prophets that we've studied, books like Hosea, and Joel, and Amos, Obadiah, and then Jonah, we saw these glimmers of hope that was spread throughout. In some of the books, actually, we only saw hope at the very close of the book. You know, there's all of this destruction, disaster, exile, and all this happens. And then right at the very end, there's a few verses that shine some hope upon the entire situation. But here in Micah, why it's one of my favorite minor prophets is because here in Micah, hope is a major theme. And that's exciting. That's really exciting. Because while, all of the biblical books somehow singularly mimic the design of the entire Bible, Micah does it to an extreme level. And here's what I mean. The Bible is a story of judgment and restoration of mankind. The entire Bible story has really two major themes. And the first is judgment, how God must confront and judge evil among his people, among mankind. And the second theme is hope, a hope of restoration, how God's covenant love and promise are more powerful than any human evil can be. The entire Bible is the story of judgment versus restoration, judgment versus hope of mankind. And we've talked about this in other minor prophet studies, or the phrase day of the Lord. And we talked about it time and again, how we've stated how the day of the Lord will either be a day of eternal judgment for those who are disobedient to the will and rule of God, or or it will be a day of hope, a day of restoration for all who obediently place their hope in the will and rule of God. And so that is the book of Micah. And that's why I'm so excited to present this book, because through its literary poetry, through the similes and the metaphors and the picture that Micah is painting, we see the story of judgment for those who are disobedient and hope for those who are obedient. And we can be part of that remnant of God, a remnant forward, because the hope that is found in Jesus Christ. So let's go ahead and dive into the book, and hopefully with the time that we have left, we'll cover chapters 1 and 2. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Hear, you peoples, all of you. Pay attention, O earth, and all that is in it. Let the Lord be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. And the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will spit open, like wax before the fire, like waters poured down on a steep place. All this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards, and I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces, and all her wages shall be burned with fire. All her idols I will lay waste. For the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return." Now, in this first section, Micah chapter 1, verses 2 through 7 specifically, it deals strictly with the pronouncement of judgment against Samaria. Verse 4 says, "The mountains will melt under him, the valleys will split open like wax before the fire, like waters poured down a steep place." This right here is imagery that's showing the undoing of creation. And that verse 4, anticipates the undoing of Samaria, which we find in verses 6 and 7. In verse 5, we find two things, the reason and the root for the judgment. Look at verse 5. It says, "All this is for the transgression of David and for the sins of the house of Israel." The punishment that will come, the reason for it is the transgression of Jacob and the sin of the house of Israel. And the root of this transgression, the root of the sin, it says that the root is Samaria and Jerusalem. It's not the house of Jacob, the transgression, the house of Jacob. Samaria is not the house of Israel, or house of Israel, Samaria, and the house of Jacob, rather, Jerusalem. This is the root here, is Samaria and Jerusalem, and this is metaphorical language that's getting at saying that the transgression, the sin, the evil that has come into these places has come from the core of these nations, from the center, the capital cities. As we've mentioned before, Samaria and Judah is the capital city of both the northern and southern nations. You guys have all seen the stories about, or school starting back now, and so what do you get your teacher when you're happy that they're your teacher, or you want to tell them you're proud of them, or whatever the case may be? You get your teacher an apple, right? And we've all seen those toy apples that have the little worms crawling out of them. I never understood why those are things. Those are things that we. I don't want a worm in my apple, but we also heard the stories of people biting into an apple and swallowing a worm up whole because the worm was inside the apple. Now, these are events that actually happen, but the way the worm gets into the apple might be different than what we expect. I thought the worm crawled from the outside in, but actually the worm doesn't do that. The worm always crawls from the inside out. And so the way that it happens is that a worm will lay its eggs on an apple blossom, at the core of an apple blossom. And as the apple grows and blooms into what we see as an apple, the eggs will hatch. And so the worm will actually begin its life in the middle of an apple, in the core of an apple. And in order to survive, it has to eat its way out. And that's how the worm gets in the apple. You're going to all throw your apples away at home now, I imagine. But that's how the worm gets into the apple, and it will crawl out from it. So the worm actually begins its life inside. And this is what happens with these nations. They're rotten to the core. The evil, the wicked, the bad was all in the core, the capitals, and it spreads out from there. And really it happens the same way with us. You remember Jesus' words in Mark chapter 7, verse 15? There's nothing outside of a person that by going into him can defile him, but instead it's the things that come out of a person. Those are what defile him. It's from the core, the heart of a person, that defilement comes. And this is an application for us. You see here on the screen, the application is that we need to be careful what we let into our hearts, because if our heart is corrupt, our whole body will be corrupt. Let's continue reading verses 8 through 16 here. In verse 8, it says, "For this I will lament and wail. I will go stripped and naked." This is Micah's mourning. Is boohooing, crying, mourning, mourning. "I will make lamentation like the jackals and mourning like the ostriches, for her wound is incurable, and it has come to Judah. It has reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all in Beth-Ophrah. Roll yourselves in the dust. Pass on your way, inhabitants of Shapher, in nakedness and shame. The inhabitants of Zaanan do not come out. The lamentation of Beth Ezel shall take away from you its standing place. For the inhabitants of Moroth wait anxiously for good, because disaster has come down from the Lord. Harness the steeds of the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish. It was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion, for in you were found the transgressions of Israel. Therefore you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Achzib shall be a deceitful thing to the kings of Israel. I will again bring a conqueror to you, inhabitants of Moreshah. The glory of Israel shall come to Adullam. Make yourselves bald and cut off your hair, for the children of your delight. Make yourselves as bald as the eagles, for they shall go from you into exile. Now, Micah really gets to his main point of proclamation beginning in verse 8, and that's against the nation of Judah. So I want you to first notice a few things. I talked about the mourning of Micah in verses 8 through 9. Now, we've talked about mourning before, or grieving over something, especially being intensely grieving or mourning, lamenting over sin. Typically that's done by wearing sackcloth, putting ash on your face, head coverings, things like this, fasting and so forth. But Micah here, notice in verses 8 and 9, he is stripped and naked. This implies that his lamentation is deep and intense. And his mourning is caused by the immorality, the sin of Judah, and how they, because of this sin, are facing the impending destruction and disaster. Another application for us on the screen here. We should always be this intensely saddened over the immorality and sinfulness that we see today. It should really bother us to the core. Just as the immorality comes from our core, if we cleanse ourselves, then it will bother us to the core. And hopefully that bothering will drive us to be people who are more moral and pure and holy and righteous. Be this intensely sad over the immorality that we face and sinfulness that we face today. Now, in verses 10 through 15, Micah begins naming off this list, and you might have got lost during it. And really the list is just very poetic, and I really truly mean that, because he is naming the cities who will face destruction, these cities that surround Judah. But he's not just naming a bunch of cities for the sake of naming a bunch of cities. Actually, when we look to the Hebrew language, you see this sort of literary poetry that Micah writes with. You won't learn any Hebrew tonight. Don't worry. I won't give you that quiz there. But I do want to give you some insight into what the poetry looks like by telling you what these words would sound like in Hebrew. Not the Hebrew sounds, but rather how they would sound closely related to the play on words that's going on here. So first he says, tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. So the word Gath in the Hebrew language actually sounds like the word in the Hebrew language to tell, all right, or tell. So Gath and tell sound similar to each other. And so when he says, tell it not in Gath, it's this play on words that's really following this, and all the following cities have this, but it's this play on words that's really saying, tell it not in Gath, or sounds like, tell it not in to tell. It's kind of a silly, poetic way to express that the opposite is going to happen. And so these cities think that prospering, they're going to flourish, they're going to grow, but instead, Micah's showing in an even deeper level, in a very poetic and literary way, that destruction and exile is imminent. But also Gath has another sort of meaning here, or an insight. If you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20, what you see there is David mourning, lamenting deeply over his anguish of the death of Saul and Jonathan. And he says in 2 Samuel 1, verse 20, he says, tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You see here, David is expressing, and he starts expressing the same sort of lament, mourning over the loss that he's incurred. And David begins with the same city that Micah begins with, Gath. Now I want you to hold on to that, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. Next, you see this word, this city, weep not at all, and Beth Le'Aphrah, roll yourselves in the dust. Beth Le'Aphrah means house of dust. So he's saying, house of dust, roll in the dust. Zaanaim, it says, pass on your way, or rather, Shaphir. Pass on your way, inhabitants of Shaphir. Shaphir sounds like beautiful, and they're supposed to pass in nakedness and shame, the opposite of beauty. Beth Ezel, it means house of taking away, and in this place the lamentation will take away their standing place. It says of Maroth, for the inhabitants of Maroth wait anxiously for good. Maroth, this word conveys the idea of bitterness, and they wait anxiously because disaster has come down from the Lord. This is bitter. Harness the steeds to the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish. Lachish sounds like, in the Hebrew language, the word steeds. And so here Micah is calling for their chariots, to harness their chariot steeds. Now, ironically, these steeds are not for fighting, but instead they're for fleeing in a swift way. He says it's in verse 14, you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. This town is associated with the word one who is betrothed, which is what you would do at a wedding. You would give parting gifts, and so it's showing what's going on here. The houses of Achzib shall be a deceitful thing. Achzib sounds like the word deceit, and they will be deceitful to the kings of Israel. Mareshah, I will again bring a conqueror to you, inhabitants of Mareshah. Mareshah sounds like the Hebrew word for conqueror, and they will have a conqueror come to them. And then finally there's Adullam. Now Adullam takes us back. It makes us reflect back to 1 Samuel this time in chapter 22, verse 1. In 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 1, David is fleeing for his life. He is afraid and fleeing for his life from Saul, the king at the time. And the place where he goes to in 1 Samuel 22 is the cave of Adullam. So this recounts David fleeing to this cave of Adullam. It's interesting that Micah here uses the first city in this list as Gath. And it's related to David's lament over Saul and Jonathan's death. And then the last city Micah recounts here is Adullam. And it reflects upon David fleeing a fear for his own life. And now we see these descendants, David's descendants, they also lament and they also flee from a hostile conqueror. And then Micah concludes in verse 16 this whole section just by showing that the threat of exile is upon them, and this is what they face. Let's go to chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It says, woe to those who devise wickedness and work evil on their beds. When the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man in his house and a man in his inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, against this family I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, and you shall not walk haughtily, for it will be a time of disaster. In that day they shall take up a taunt song against you and moan bitterly and say, we are utterly ruined. He changes the portion of my people, how he ruins it from me. To an apostate he allots our fields. Therefore you will have none to cast the line by lot in the assembly of the Lord. Do not preach, thus they preach. One should not preach of such things. Disgrace will not overtake us. Should this be said, O house of Jacob, has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? But lately my people have risen up as an enemy. You strip the rich from those who pass by trustingly with no thought of war. The women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. From the young children you take away my splendor forever. Arise and go, for this is no place to rest because of the uncleanness that destroys with a grievous destruction. If a man should go about and utter wind and lies, saying, I will preach to you of wine and strong drink, he would be the preacher for this people. So, what you see here, the first 5 verses, I know that's a lot, but kind of follow me and refer back as we talk about this. In the first 5 verses here, it deals with these leaders and how they were acting in a very unjust way, and they were exploiting the vulnerable, which again we saw back in, I believe, in Amos. And what we see in these 5 verses is this sort of courtroom scenario. So verses 1 and 2 shows the accusations against the people. Verses 3 through 4 shows the sentencing that they receive. And then verse 5 shows the punishment that they receive. And this punishment ultimately leads to the loss of hope of any inheritance that these leaders would have ever had. I want you to look for a moment, though, back at verse 2. It says, they covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them away. They oppress a man in his house and a man in his inheritance. Now, one of the things you have to remember about the Old Testament is that God was always really great to protect the Israelite landowner. Land stayed within the family, and you couldn't get rid of it outside of the family. You didn't give it to other people or sell it away. And if you ever fell in hard times and you had to actually sell your land because of the hard times you were in, instead of going into slavery, all you had to do was wait until the 50th year, the Jubilee year. And in the Jubilee year, it was commanded in God's law, in the Mosaic law, it was commanded that whatever land you had to sell in order to save yourself was to be given back to you free of charge. That's pretty cool, right? These student loans that are going on right now. Boy, if I can just wait till my 50th year, maybe they'll just give them back, they'll forgive me free of charge. I don't know. Anyways, God protected the land of the poor. But there were some rich people who would seize the land. They would take it from them, and they would take it from all the lower class people, and they would have no intentions of returning it. And we actually see an occurrence of this that maybe Mike is alluding to in 1 Kings chapter 21. This is where Ahab, this wicked and evil king who was married to, you remember, Jezebel, all right? Ahab becomes jealous over this fruitful, productive land that's close to his house, a land of a man named Naboth. And so he goes to Naboth and tries to buy it, but Naboth is a devout man following God's will, and he says, no, I can't sell it outside of my family. That would be breaking the law, so I'm not going to do it. So Ahab goes back to his house, and he does what most all husbands end up doing, and he pouts and whines and tells his wife Jezebel, he just won't let me sell, he won't sell me this house. And Jezebel is like, dude, man up, okay? You're the king, just take it. And so that's exactly what Ahab does. So Ahab and Jezebel, they devise up this plan where they have Naboth stoned unjustly, and they end up taking his land. Don't worry, later on they get what's coming to them, and they die these horrible deaths because they were horrible, wicked people. But Micah seems to be alluding to this here in verse 4, this type of ruthless and unjust behavior of the leaders in the nations. And he expands upon this in verses 6 through 11, where he shows that the leaders ultimately just completely reject God's message altogether. In verse 7, he says that these leaders thought that their gracious God would never, ever bring disaster. But here's another application we can learn from this. That they ask, should this be said, O house of Jacob, has the Lord grown impatient? Are these his deeds? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? They thought God would never bring disaster, but here's the application for us. While God is full of grace and mercy and forgiveness, he is also just and righteous, and he will bring disaster to those who reject his message. And it's a lesson they had to learn then and a lesson we need to learn now. God is the same God always and whoever has been and ever will be. And He's a God of grace and mercy and love and forgiveness, but He's also just and righteous, and I'm thankful that He is. And He will bring disaster and destruction to those who willingly reject His message. Now, if you continue on, verses 8 through 9 shows that the people have become an enemy to all of God's people. And they do this really by doing three things. Number one, they take advantage of their friends, those who trust them. They take advantage of the women, and they take advantage of the children. These are ruthless, wicked, evil people who are only after their own gain. And ultimately, this leads up to the culmination of verse 11, where Micah says, hey, if this preacher comes in with wine and strong drink, and he says, hey, I'll preach to you with wine and strong drink, that will be your preacher. And what Micah's saying is this. He says, look, you people who reject God's message, you're going to accept something, some message, and so they accept this message. Hey, I can live this wicked and evil lifestyle and still be called righteous and holy. If that preacher is preaching that message, I'm going to accept it. And isn't that something that we're very familiar with today? I hope to never stand from a pulpit and preach a message that is wayward or against the Word of God. And while there are messages of positivity and encouragement, while there are messages of prosperity, we need to be careful not to fall into the trap of what we have coined the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. We don't need to receive teaching that okays our evil and sinful and selfish lifestyles. Because the application for us is that we need to be careful not to reject God's message, no matter how difficult it may be. We should never give in to preaching that condones sinful lifestyles. And that's exactly what these people do. They give in to that. And we need to be careful not to give in to that. With a lot of different preaching going on today, there's a lot of people who will try to convince followers that, hey, it's okay what you do. It's okay to live that way. It's okay to take part in that. It's okay to do this, and so on. That's a message that is very inviting and very accepting and very easy to say, okay, yeah, I like that. I'll follow that one. Whereas sometimes God's message, even though inviting and welcoming, sometimes God's message is tough. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's one that we have to not reject. Otherwise, we'll be accepting the wrong message. And so let's accept the message of God and accept what He has to say for us. While we may not have health, wealth, prosperity this side of eternity, I can assure you the eternal reward will be well worth every sacrifice we make here. Fortunately, this is not where the message of Micah in chapters 1 and 2 ends. It's not with this message of judgment and destruction. Instead, look at verses 12 and 13. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. I will set them together like a sheep in a fold, like a flock in its pasture, a noisy multitude of men. He who opens the breach goes up before them. They break through and pass the gate, going out by it. Their king passes on before them, the Lord at their head. Micah says that God will bring a remnant together to bring about hope and restoration. Doesn't that excite you? Hope and restoration. And in this section of hope, we actually see the dichotomy between hope and judgment, judgment versus hope once again. I want you to notice in verse 12, it's basically showing that the Lord gathers His sheep, protecting them from judgment by deliverance. God is presented as the good shepherd who will lead His remnant as sheep into the pasture, rescuing them from exile and disaster. He brings about deliverance, which will protect the people from the impending judgment awaiting those who are disobedient and wayward. And then in verse 13, the Lord is portrayed as one who leads His sheep to hope and victorious triumph. God is the great King, rescuing His people and leading them to this triumphant victory. He'll pass into the victory before them, preparing the way, and He will reign as head over them for all of time. Isn't that exciting? How great it is to be a child of God, to be a remnant of His, who He will restore and redeem, who He will love forever. And even though He rules over us, He welcomes us into that kingdom. as being people who are citizens of it, and as being people who are productive and loving just as He is in that kingdom. And there's one final application for today, that in this application will be reinforced throughout our study of Micah. The application is that destruction and disaster will always come to those who are disobedient. But the remnant of those who are righteously obeying God's just and holy command will be delivered up by the hope of the victorious triumph found only in the Lord, in Yahweh. The question that we're left with tonight is, will you be that remnant? I hope you have a good night.